Hey guys, Scripted here with another video, and I know for some of you guys this is going to be old news. It's a topic I've never given my take on, and somebody tweeted something related to this, and I scrolled past it, and then I decided, hey, you know what, I need to look into this, because, like I said, I've never talked about it. I didn't have a YouTube channel at that time. I hadn't discussed this issue, but this is really important because there's a major conflict here between George Lucas and the Star Wars story group and people involved with Star Wars. And so somebody's full of crap here. Somebody is full of crap. And I think it's the story group, but there's absolutely no way that any of this stuff should have been said or talked about. And we'll talk about why. But Star Wars, how George Lucas's Episode 7 outline became The Last Jedi. Rian Johnson has been the subject of much ire in the past few weeks. Petitions have been created and signed by thousands of angry fans, some begging Disney to erase Episode 8 from continuity, and others hoping that Episode 9 won't have too many jokes. And then there's the matter of the film's audience score on Rotten Tomatoes. It currently holds a 50% score, making The Last Jedi the worst Star Wars film among fans, even worse than all of the prequels, which, objectively be damned, seems a tad unfair to me. However you feel about The Last Jedi, we've learned a few things about the making of the movie that prove that Johnson wasn't trying to ruin your childhood with his deconstruction and criticism of the Star Wars saga, but rather was in part following a plan laid out by George Lucas himself. Indeed, Lucas had a hand in the telling of The Last Jedi. And see, this is where this gets really deceptive, because this is people in Disney making these claims. If they're not true, I don't know how this hasn't been dealt with publicly by people from Disney. And I think that's really awful that they wouldn't do that. Because if you're just straight up lying about the fact that George Lucas wanted to do what Rian Johnson did so that you can try and justify your crappy movie 2 weeks after it comes out, I just think that's disgusting. Like, if it was anybody, even if it wasn't anybody, you shouldn't just lie and say that somebody was involved in something that they weren't. But just listen to this. It's not even just things they've said. As revealed by The Art of Star Wars: The Last Jedi via Slash Film, Johnson's movie used many of the concepts Lucas first had in mind for Episode 7. Like, for them to put this in this book, this is a published book by Disney, and to have it not be true, if it's not true, that's really terrible, and that should be completely retracted. That book should be removed. Lucas first had in mind for Episode 7 specifically the story of an older, broken Luke training a young Force-sensitive disciple named Kira, who they later named Rey. We know that when Disney bought Lucasfilm and the rights to Star Wars, it also purchased Lucas's ideas for the sequel trilogy. Okay, so far that's true, which he had been planning to make himself before he decided to sell the franchise. But I've done videos about his story treatments. He talks about the wills. He talks about a whole bunch of stuff. At no point in any of those interviews that I've used before or mentioned before did he mention anything about Luke being a hermit. Literally never. So I don't know where this is coming from. Let me know in the comment section if you know of an interview where he said he was going to do that. I could see him maybe saying it in passing, like, oh, I thought about that. But I have not heard him say a word that was what he was going to do. He wrote a story treatment and planned to participate behind the scenes as a consultant when it came time to craft the story for what would eventually become The Force Awakens. Despite the fact that J.J. Abrams eventually scrapped many of Lucas's ideas for Episode 7, the story treatment was used as a jumping off point for a new generation of creators to create the next era of Star Wars. But remember, in his Charlie Rose interview, George wasn't involved. He wasn't even a consultant. He was nothing. He was totally gone, and he was not happy with what they did. So that doesn't really jive either, that he had involvement in any capacity. I know they had meetings back in like 2013 or whatever, before he sold. But the question is, what were those meetings? And after that, and after he sold, he was not involved. And he says in the Charlie Rose interview, they didn't want me involved. And then he says, oh, I didn't really want to anyway, because it would have been too hard for me. I would have had to hover over the director, yada, 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 yada. So they gave him the boot. He's very diplomatic when he says they didn't want me there, but also I didn't want to be there either. That's him being very diplomatic and being classy about the fact that they gave him the boot. Imagine how stupid you'd have to be to do that. And honestly, I think that's where this whole downfall of Star Wars begins. And I'm not saying I always like everything George does, but when you have him there, the guy who created this entire thing, and you have him there and he's saying to you, hey, I'll happily be part of this. Just have me as a consultant. We can, do Zoom calls, whatever, right? Like, it's today's technology, right? He wouldn't even have to be on set. You just do some Zooms and do some meetings through that method, and then he can do his own thing that he wants to do, would be with his family or whatever. But for him to offer you that, and you don't take that offer, and you say goodbye, you'd have to be a complete idiot. Like, you'd have to be a complete idiot. Now, that doesn't mean they would have to do everything that he wanted them to do, because legally they bought the thing. They can do what they want with it. But it's like, you wouldn't want him as a consultant? It sounds like you didn't want him as a consultant because you probably thought he was going to hate your ideas, which included Luke being a hermit on an island, and you didn't want him there complaining every day to you why you're doing that. That's what it sounds like to me. We don't know. We weren't there. I wasn't a fly on the wall, but according to the art book, Lucas sat in on the first creative meetings for Episode 7, which took place on Skywalker Ranch in January 2013, mere months before the Disney deal. The earliest concepts for the Jedi Temple on the planet that would become Ahch-To were ironed out during these meetings, as well as visualizations of what older Luke and young Kira, who's Rey, would look like. Lucas even approved the design for the bell-shaped structure for the Jedi Temple. Okay. So right there, it just sounds like they're just doing concept art. There's nothing story. Among the early designs tossed around for Luke were ones that looked pretty close to what we got in The Last Jedi, as well as one or two that were a bit radical, such as a bald Luke Skywalker who looked closer to a Buddhist monk than a shaggy hermit. And yes, we've seen that art, and they even considered doing that with Anakin. I think for Revenge of the Sith, I'm pretty sure I saw concept art of him with a bald head. And some kind of marking on his face, I think, too. Kira's concept didn't stray too far from the plucky young heroine we got in Rey. Her robes were a bit different, but nothing too extreme. So far, it's all just concept art. How are these characters going to look? Okay, no story. But Lucas's biggest contribution to The Last Jedi was the Luke-Rey story itself, which he'd originally planned for Episode 7, as confirmed by Lucasfilm Story Group member Pablo Hidalgo on Twitter via comicbook.com. Okay, so it was on Twitter. The idea played out much like what we saw in Johnson's movie. Luke is down and out on a distant planet 30 years after the fall of the Empire. A New Hope named Kira finds the old Jedi Master, and they begin their training. We would have seen Luke struggling with his failure to stop the Jedi Killer, named Kylo Ren, from destroying his Jedi Academy. There's also a really intriguing concept mentioned in the art of Star Wars The Last Jedi that suggests that Luke would have been haunted by a Sith ghost during the movie. Okay, but that's just concept art. That doesn't mean that's what Lucas would have done. So, what is Pablo Hidalgo talking about? Hidalgo was responding to people saying that Lucas would have preferred to do something closer to the EU by saying that no, these were his ideas, basically, is what we're getting from this. Because if you go to thecomicbook.com, that's what he was responding to, was people complaining that it should have been more like the EU. Which in some ways I think it would have been. I think because Lucas has said, like, it wouldn't have been in like, he wanted to do the Wills, he wanted to do sort of more midichlorian oriented Will stuff and stuff like that, but he did want Han Solo and Leia's kids to be involved. Kids, plural, not one. So it stands to reason there was probably some storylines involving the Solo kids that he was into, I would assume. But how far he went, he would go with that, we don't technically know, because again, what we do know about his sequel treatments is there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of that in there that we know about. But he has, again, said publicly that he was wanting the story to have a lot more of them in it, not just one of them. He said that to J.J. Abrams in an interview. Luke always had this potential dark side within him, being that his father was Darth Vader, explained Lucasfilm executive creator-director Doug Chiang of the character's arc in the early days of Episode 7. I have to assume that a guy like Doug Chiang would have been in those meetings, right? The executive creator, Doug Chiang? Because he was the director from 95 to 2002, and then he came back in 2013. I know it took place in January, but, like, I don't know the exact month he was rehired or whatever, but I have to think he was there during the prequels. So if this isn't true, he's just blatantly lying. Okay, so he is really struggling with that. He's talking about Luke. He ended up secluding himself in this Jedi temple on a new planet, and he's just there meditating, reassessing his whole life. Gradually, over the arc of the movie, he rediscovers his vitality and comes back to himself. Eventually, Luke would have regained his mojo while teaching Kira the ways of the Force and rejoined the fight. That's basically the skeleton of The Last Jedi's plot. Lucas also had a part in crafting the Kylo Ren storyline, including the fact that the villain was to be revealed as Han and Leia's son. Hidalgo also mentioned a character named Skylar in his tweets who eventually became Finn. It was a screenwriter Michael Ardent's idea to push this story to episode 8, while Ardent was eventually replaced by Abrams and Kasdan, who co-wrote the final draft of The Force Awakens. He came up with the basic structure of the plot, which involved the search for Luke Skywalker, a victory lap for Han Solo, who had always been marked for death in 7. Like, if they were going to use, if these were all George Lucas's ideas, Luke being a hermit and everything, and he was on board for all the stuff they eventually did anyway, then why did they give him the boot? Why didn't they keep him as a consultant? Because he's apparently he agreed with all of this stuff. These were his ideas. So him being a consultant isn't going to bug you. He's not going to be complaining. You're going to be doing what he wanted. So why did you give him the boot then? This doesn't make sense. It's been widely reported in the past that Disney and Abrams chose not to use Lucas's treatment for the sequel trilogy, deciding to craft an original story instead. The Art of Star Wars: The Last Jedi and Hidalgo's comments indicate that this isn't entirely true. Lucas never wrote the scripts for 7, 8, and 9, which means we'll never truly know what he intended to do with the sequels. Yet, he was a part of the process early on, and the sequel trilogy still carries part of his vision. But then, see, now we got another conflict. So Hidalgo and Chang are insinuating that George sort of came up with this stuff, and they're insinuating it a week or two after The Last Jedi comes out in a book and on Twitter and stuff like that and in interviews. But again, they booted Lucas and then did what he wanted? That doesn't make any sense. At least one person involved with the sequels, Mark Hamill himself, is a little disappointed that Lucas hasn't been more involved with the franchise going forward. He says, "What I wish is that Disney had been more accepting of Lucas's guidance and advice, because he had an outline for 7, 8, and 9, and it is vastly different to what they have done." You don't think that, like, Luke's on set in The Last Jedi, or he reads the script, and then he's like, what the heck is this? Because he knows George, he's talked to him many times. He probably called him and said, "George, did you intend on doing this to Luke?" And George was probably like, "No, I didn't." And that's why Mark Hamill says, and it is vastly different from what they have done. So he obviously knows something about what Lucas was going to do, especially with his character. I'm sure he talked to him about it. Of course he did. And Lucas hated episode 7, and he hated what they did. And they were working on 8. He knew what they were doing. He hated it. He said it in the Charlie Rose interview. So I think these Lucasfilm guys are full of crap. But we're going to have even more information about that. It's safe to assume that since George Lucas's ideas for episode 7 were pushed to the next installment, the direction the story would have taken in the pre-Rian Johnson episode 8 could have been vastly different, at the very least in terms of Luke's ongoing arc. If George Lucas liked the way Luke was, and Kylo Ren destroying his Jedi order and all this other stuff, and they pushed it to 8, I don't think he would have been that upset about that. You know what I mean? Like, he sold it to them. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, oh, well, they're still doing more or less what I wanted. I just wanted it in 7. That sucks. Because he's a very diplomatic guy when he answers, for the most part. So it's like, no, dude. There's no possible way this is part of his... Lucas still very much influenced at least one installment of the new era of Star Wars. It is perhaps fitting that it's the most divisive chapter in the trilogy. Why do people think like this? After all, The Force Awakens was meant to be a celebration. Okay, so here's the kicker, though. Here's the kicker, and this is where I am just like, how have they not retracted this art book that Hidalgo's making these comments in? How have they not retracted the tweets? How are they allowed to do this and talk smack? Because it's garbage. Well, look at this. So Screen Rant actually did an article before the Den of Nerds article. Excuse me, Den of Geek article. And so the Den of Geek article came out in March of 2018. So this is 4 months before that. 3 months before that, I guess. And this is just a couple days after The Last Jedi came out, right? Because it came out December 20th or something in 2017, somewhere along those lines. Just before this article, basically. And they say the same things. They use the same quotes. And, okay, yeah, the concept art, all that stuff. They use the same quotes from Hidalgo and stuff. But here's the kicker. Update. I don't know when they updated this. This post incorrectly states that the below plot outline was what George Lucas envisioned for Star Wars Episode 7. Lucas was only shown the concept art of the original Jedi Temple. He had no input on story details regarding J.J. Abrams' The Force Awakens. The original article follows. Right? And they're saying Force Awakens because they were saying that what The Last Jedi was what George wanted Episode 7 to be. So I'm assuming that Screen Rant got some kind of message from somebody at Lucasfilm, or somebody from Lucas's camp, telling them that no, we had a few meetings and we discussed concept art and stuff and how things should look. We didn't get into story. So who's lying? Is George Lucas, is this what he really wanted? Right? I don't think it is. He's never said it is. He said the opposite. Mark Hamill said the opposite. So how are Doug Chiang and Hidalgo allowed to get away with just bald-faced or bold-faced lying like that? They're just straight up lying. And that Art of the Last Jedi book should be completely retracted. Has Disney come out and retracted anything? Was this all they did? Is this Disney? Or was this not Lucas's camp? Is this Disney covering their tracks after this article came out because it's a bunch of lies? So anyway, so you've got a company that gets rid of a guy who they could have kept around because this is how I see it. They didn't want to do what he wanted, so they gave him the boot. So they had these meetings, and they probably did talk story, and he probably disagreed with it. So they booted him, did the trilogy, and then made claims that he was the reason they made these absolutely god-awful decisions that for most people ended the brand. Right? The Last Jedi ended the brand for like half the fans. That right then and there, they literally lost half of their fans. TFA sucked, but again, people were like, maybe they'll explain it in 8, maybe it'll make sense. And no, they actually just destroyed it completely. And then these guys are running around saying that, oh no, it's George Lucas's story. It's just not our fault that Luke got ruined and Star Wars is lost half of its fan base. It's because George wanted this. He agreed. It's George's idea. How are they getting away with this? George, come out and say something about these morons, please, for the love. And he's not that type of guy though. Like he wouldn't pinpoint a specific individual. I don't think he would maybe make a broader statement, but. Bro, this is so disgusting. And this is why Star Wars completely failed. From the very beginning, they were already completely botching it and making the worst possible decisions imaginable. All of them. Whether it's JJ, whether it's Ryan, whether it's KK, whether it's whoever, they all, from literally the second that this deal was going to go through, were screwing it up. And, of course, the biggest one being, how do you not keep him on as a consultant? Well, of course you don't, because you're not going to do what he wants. Unbelievable. And I'm surprised, even before this sort of retraction was made, even just reading this Den of Geek article, you kind of get the impression that something doesn't feel right about this. This feels weird. Because the only evidence they have is this concept art. So whoop-de-doo. There's tons of different concept arts for all his movies, too, that he didn't use. Like, that doesn't have anything to do with anything. And it sounds like they just exaggerated everything. Like, give me a break. So this is all lies. And there's still people that actually think this, though, too. Once in a while, you'll see a tweet or something about how, oh, no, George had Luke as a hermit on an island and this and that and the other thing. And it's like, no, that's just what they said because they did that. And the other thing about this, too, is this whole, like, Kira thing that turns into Rey. He said he wanted it to be about the solo children. So Rey was probably supposed to be like Jaina. Like, this whole thing is a bunch of crap. Anyways, guys, you let me know in the comment section, like, how do you feel about this? Like, have you now lost whatever little shrivel of respect you had for any of these people, if you even had any in the first place, or had any going into watching this video? Let me know in the comment section what you think. If you like this content, please like, subscribe. It always helps the channel. Feel free to check anything else on my channel. Have yourselves a very good day.